Welcome back, everyone, to the main stage. And let me take a moment to say a big hello to those of you who are watching at any of our international watch parties, or, of course, joining us from the comfort of your own home on the application. You are at the very center of the conversation. Thank you for joining us at the summit. You are here in our hearts, I can assure you. But for those of you who are here inside the room, we've got another phenomenal panel planned for you. How do we make way for blockchain for enterprise? How do we make sure that we are equipped and ready to exploit the opportunities? In this next panel, we will explore the critical considerations and solutions necessary to harness the transformative power of blockchain technology in the enterprise landscape. This promises to be a world-beating discussion with lots of tools and takeaways that you'll be able to apply and employ straight away. So let's get right to it. Chairing this panel is Leah Callan Butler, CoinDesk columnist. Let's hear it for the panelists and our panel leader.
I might pull up my chair a little bit so I can see you guys. All right, thanks for having us here, everybody. So we're here to talk about blockchain for enterprise, but I actually think that this title is a little bit misleading. So we're very lucky today to have Brian from ADGM, which is Abu Dhabi Global Markets, and Vanessa from VARA, which is the Virtual Asset Regulatory Authority of Dubai. So we've got two regulators on the stage. So it's going to be crazy for me to say that I think we might actually break the rules and go a little bit outside the guidelines and maybe talk about some use cases beyond enterprise in terms of how we're thinking about that in the current landscape here. So to kick us off, do you want to just give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself? Vanessa, do you want to go first?
Sure. As you mentioned, I work for the Dubai Virtual Asset Regulatory Authority. And first of all, thank you so much for having us, and it's so great to be here. I head up ecosystem development for the regulator in Dubai. And essentially, VARA was established into law in March of 2022. And it was an initiative that came out of Dubai's 2033 strategy to enhance the digital economy in Dubai. And essentially, that was making sure that we were looking at how the foundations of the digital economy are, in fact, blockchain and virtual assets. And one of the core pillars of building out that industry in Dubai is by having proper regulatory framework. And so in March of 2022, Law Number 4 essentially issued VARA as the authority for virtual assets in the Emirate of Dubai. We oversee all free zones, mainland, with the exception of DIFC, which is a financial free zone. They do offshore. So that's just a little bit about our history, essentially. After we were initiated into law, we essentially launched the full market regulations February 7th of 2023, so just 11 months later. So we're still quite new.
Yeah.
We are the world's first independent regulatory authority specifically focused on virtual assets.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that introduction. And Brian, how about you?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Brian. I am with the Financial Services Regulatory Authority in Abu Dhabi, and that is the Abu Dhabi Global Market, which is an international financial center that focuses on primarily the offshore international markets. The center is about 8 years old, so it has a level of history around what has actually been built out of Abu Dhabi and the need to focus on the digital asset space and to extend what we do. My primary role is within the licensing authority to look at firms that are running tech infrastructure, virtual assets, products and capabilities as they get licensed. And once they're licensed, we supervise them, and that's the team that I'm in with FinTech. We provide oversight for these firms. Now that's like one of my hats. The other one is where we look at fostering innovation. So we look at the broader ecosystem of the Abu Dhabi global market and ask questions around what fundamental aspects do we see that are, are there or missing or need deepening? Again, catering to the firms that we are attracting to the jurisdiction, who are offshore. Comparing again with Vanessa, who is looking onshore, and who typically focus on a more institutional base. So we'll obviously go a bit more into the nature of the frameworks and what we're doing, but I think that gives a bit of a background as to who we are as the Abu Dhabi global market.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great introduction. Thank you so much. So as you suggested, maybe we can dig into a little bit more. I'd love to understand a little bit more about what are the priorities and objectives of ADGM and VARA. Maybe you could explain that a little bit. Do you want to go first, Brian?
Yeah, sure. So our primary objective is to be able to identify areas that we as Abu Dhabi Global Market can continue to be progressive in our regulatory frameworks. So we came out with a virtual assets framework in 2018. And as you can appreciate, back then, it was just after 2017. There was a lot of activity, I will call it, in the market. And what we did at that time was to provide the clarity that firms were looking for in our jurisdiction, and for clients who are in our jurisdiction that were seeking. So a number of things that happened last year, say, the kind of challenges with algorithmic stablecoins, those were not possible within ADGM because the framework we set out determined early on that those would not be permitted activities. And just to give an example, out of the 20,000 odd plus virtual assets that exist, we go through a process of determining which ones are permitted. We have something known as the accepted virtual assets regime, and that allows us to set virtual assets that are that firms can offer, that firms can provide to their clients, that they can custody, that they can trade, and so forth. And we, as a jurisdiction, are focused on continually driving the kind of regulatory clarity that is needed. And at the moment, our focus areas are things like DeFi and being able to work very closely with firms that are in that space. So if you're building something for, whether it's the tokenization, staking, yield farming capabilities, we're very keenly working in these areas from regulatory framework, but also in some cases building the tools, right? Because the industry doesn't have some of these tools that help regulators, so we have to build these ourselves internally. And what that allows us to do is, in some cases, come up with the discussion paper like we did last year, setting out high level what we think will be the areas of interest for supervisors, but then also now working closely with firms so that we can work on the consultation paper that we're looking to issue next year in Q1. And we hope that that kind of clarity will continually attract the kind of firms that are looking for those investor and consumer protections that we provide in the frameworks.
Yeah.
Got it.
Great. Yeah, and so for VARA, we launched our regulations just February 7th. But we had the benefit of learning from what the other global jurisdictions were doing in the virtual asset space. And our mission was really to regulate virtual assets from A to Z. And we did this by adapting an activity and principle-based regulatory framework. So we license according to activity. And by nature, our regulator is technology agnostic. When we were developing the regulations, a core part of how we developed the regulations and a core function of ecosystem development, which I head up, is to engage industry in the process of developing our regulations. So taking that activity and principle-based approach was really feedback we were getting from VASPs that were coming from all over the world. And so we license across now 8 different activities: exchange, broker-dealer, lending, borrowing, asset management, advisory, transfer settlements, custody, and we've recently added an 8th under our issuance rulebook. Now, something that's important for us is we are technology agnostic, so our issuance rulebook really is more of, we have 3 categories of issuance. Category 2 and 3, essentially most tokens go through an approval process. So it's essentially a white paper that would be submitted. We don't have a prescriptive list of like green tokens that we accept or a blacklist either. The one limitation is obviously privacy coins that have no traceability. So that's kind of the approach that we took to move away from a product-based kind of licensing process or approval process. And we felt that that would allow us to be more agile and to essentially be able to, what we do within the licensing process, and a big part of my job as well, is to engage with new VASPs that are interested in coming into the Dubai ecosystem, is essentially we do a case-by-case evaluation of a lot of the new business models and innovations that are coming into the licensing pipeline. You know, because we're interested more in their activity and in from a licensing perspective, we're already seeing things, and this is a big priority for us too. But we're already seeing DeFi DAO business models coming through our licensing pipeline. So this is something that we're, you know, a big part of it for us is constantly speaking with industry, sort of on an ongoing basis. Engagement with industry, it's just part of our ethos. We're constantly speaking with VASPs, and especially with VASPs in the licensing pipeline, we're regularly doing consultation process. And some of our priorities from a regulatory perspective now, we're going to be launching guidelines on derivatives. We're also looking at real-world tokenization. A sandbox framework will be coming out soon, which is kind of also allowing startups to come into the market, actually. We're looking at also, I think I mentioned DeFi DAOs, that includes GameFi, because we're seeing huge trends in the GameFi space.
And I think something else that you've mentioned as well, Vanessa, is the recognition that the regulators don't exist in isolation.
Yeah.
And we're part of global international bodies, whether that's IOSCO, for example, on the securities side. There are various MOUs that exist within regulatory bodies. And what that ensures is that with each regulatory framework in a jurisdiction, you'll see that there are differences depending on key areas of focus, risk appetite, and obviously risk tolerance that's defined within those jurisdictions. And just as Vanessa pointed out, they're focused very much on virtual assets. We, for example, cover virtual assets and traditional instruments, whether you're doing lending, borrowing, banking services, and all of that. So there is a need to recognize that this is not in isolation. And then the second thing I was going to add, just as well, you triggered a memory there, is around in the Web3 crypto space, there's that constant conversation around the trilemma.
Yeah.
And in the regulatory space, we have that equally. I mean, it is, are you being able to bring up regulatory clarity and frameworks with speed very, very quickly?
Yeah.
Are you doing it in a way that provides the necessary protections for investors and consumers? And then on the third prong is, how much are you fostering or inhibiting innovation? So it's a continuous, process of dynamically adjusting where that regulatory framework sits. Sometimes there's a guidance that is leaning more towards clarity, and then other times and protections, and at other times leaning more towards the ability to foster the innovation that the industry needs.
Yeah, and just 2 points to add on to what Brian just mentioned. I think one, part of what we've tried to do, and I know ADGM is thinking in a similar way, is looking at passportability. This is something that we don't see enough in the virtual asset industry, and it's something that, as VASPs are coming into the ecosystem, is a big question mark, is how can we as regulators work together, both in the UAE and globally, to be looking at passportability to make, to help support VASPs doing business in our ecosystems, and also even be better at protecting our own consumers and investors through information sharing and other mechanisms. So that's definitely one. And then in terms of constantly being agile, when we launched our regulations on February 7th, I mean, it was done in consultation with VASPs and with the industry, but we actually wrote it very clearly in our regulations that this was a live document. And already,
it's a startup.
Yeah, we are. I mean, to be fair, we are a government startup in a lot of ways. We're a brand new regulatory authority. But already since February 7th, we've issued 2 new amendments to the regulations, one under custody and one under issuance. issuance, and we have several more amendments kind of coming down the pipeline because we're constantly in learning mode and trying to be as agile to respond to the market as possible.
Yep.
Yeah.
I love that commitment to industry engagement and this idea that it's a constant iteration. I feel like one of the frustrations from industry has often been that, if you're dealing with regulations that aren't fit for purpose, it makes it so difficult to move forward. So I feel like that's a great approach to be able to overcome that. I want to come back to what you were talking about in terms of the difficulty in terms of balancing innovation and protection. But first, can I just ask, what are some of the opportunities and challenges that are presented from a regulatory perspective for enterprises that are looking at adopting blockchain? Maybe we can start with opportunities first, and then we'll tackle challenges next.
You can go. So I think that one of the key opportunities, and we've been talking about it a lot, or key opportunities and challenges, I think it's both a bit, is that the regulator needs to constantly be keeping up with innovation, right?
Yeah.
This is something that it's an ongoing process and an ongoing challenge, and to be in regular learning mode. I think in Dubai we have the benefit of being kind of in a small environment. Now, the VASPs that are coming into our ecosystem are able to do both onshore and offshore activities, but our regulations need to be able to apply to a whole host of different innovations and ideas and business models that are coming into the ecosystem. I think that there are a number of ways of looking at it. I mean, as I've mentioned several times already, we're in constant consultation mode as VASPs are going through the licensing process, whether it's one-on-ones, focus groups, written submissions. But more than that, we're actually looking to now do sort of we're launching hopefully in the first half of next year, sort of a quasi-sandbox framework. And I say quasi in the sense that we want any new business models coming into the ecosystem to be able to operate in the market, at least with a limited customer base, so that we can actually in real life test how our regulations need to be adapted to the new innovations that are coming in. So I think that's kind of how we're approaching that, and making sure that we're engaging even new business ideas that might not fully fall within our regulatory framework, making sure that we're not saying no, right? We want to be as inclusive as possible, as long as they're meeting our regulatory requirements.
It's a very open-minded approach.
Trying, yeah.
Yeah.
What about you, Brian? Opportunities?
So they sort of fall within three broad categories in my mind. The first one is when you look at an enterprise, fundamentally they're looking for a degree of trust into the activities that they'll be engaging when they interact within the entire Web3 space. And one of the challenges that is there is the predictability of how much additional risk am I taking versus obviously what you're looking for as an outcome. So if you think about an entity that looks to, let's just take an example of a merchant who is looking to accept payment mechanisms using virtual assets. They want to be able to know, can I know for sure that this payment has gone through? Who is going to hold this on my behalf? Do I need to do any action on my own because to convert this into fiat? And are there additional hidden costs like insurance because my insurance provider can't do this and I need to engage someone else? And all of these become questions potentially with the current setup, additional complexity because of the counterparties involved, and that becomes a significant hurdle for how do I then go ahead to embrace this advancement if it's going to require me to do 3, 4, 5 different onboardings of different counterparties, and then need to wrap my head around the associated risk and make sure that I monitor it so that fundamentally I'm continuing on a net-net basis to have the net positive that I'm looking for. Part of that is, do I actually know that these counterparties I'm engaging with are operating on a good intent basis and within a regulated environment so that I know that there are certain oversight that is happening for them to protect me as a consumer of those services. So that's sort of like one item. The second is, when you think beyond that, so let's say that's been overcome, you then ask, how deep is this space that I can, as an enterprise, engage with it? From a retail perspective, dealing with $1,000, $2,000 equivalent and so forth is fine. Institutional enterprise level needs much, much more. It needs to be much deeper. You need deeper liquidity. And some of the challenges, it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. You need the demand to attract the supply, but then at the same time, you need the supply to attract the demand. And I think part of that conversation is now progressing to a level where we see bigger firms coming and establishing within the region. We have firms that have set up within ADGM that are looking and are actually in the process right now of bringing much of that international liquidity into the region, and that allows more enterprise capabilities using our regulatory frameworks. We think that predictability is important. And just as an example of where there's a nexus between the two, just this week, we, as ADGM, published the DLT Foundations framework, which allows for the formation of legal entity structures around blockchain foundations, DAOs, and so forth. And naturally, you ask yourself, well, where are they going to custody those tokens? How are they going to do governance? How are they going to own and control real-world assets? All of those parts come together. Now, the third and last item, to my mind, is being able to identify that there is a continued, because once you have the asset, you naturally ask, how can I earn yield? How can I lend, borrow? How can I continue to do more things with this asset, with this virtual asset, right? And today, we still talk about many of the aspects in the space on a very isolated basis. One custodian has a virtual asset. Can I go on a different trading venue and be able to use that? Is there a clearing and settlement mechanism between them? Does there need to be one? If you're an enterprise, certainly you expect it. You don't want the complexity of move assets from A to B, then I can lend them, move them to C, then I can earn yield. And we think that these are some of the opportunities that are in the market for firms to be able to come in with capabilities that speak to that level of integration, but which significantly take the burden off of individual enterprises in needing to do the bridging across these different pools of liquidity, of assets, of custody, of yield. Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of opportunity for the regulator to work with industry to ensure that there are the right components to enhance the ecosystem, right? Because I think it all needs to be cyclical, to be able to adapt and make sure that there's that sense of security. Our regulations are quite rigorous, and we've prioritized at this stage bringing in vast exchange custodians, broker dealers, et cetera, that can fill in really core pieces of the ecosystem to ensure that there is scalability for these types of new innovations and a sense of security, trust, and credibility in the ecosystem.
Got it. Yeah, I guess if you're going to come and do business here, you want to make sure that there are all the services and people that you need to interact with. That's given us a really good overview of it. I'm just thinking we might have people in the audience who are actually thinking about setting up business here. So when they're thinking about this, could you walk us through maybe some of the key compliance requirements or even best practices that you look for in businesses that might be setting up here?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Should I start? Okay. So from an ADGM perspective, it really comes down to what activity specifically you're looking to do in ADGM. And I say that often because we encounter a firm which comes in and says, we want to come to ADGM. Naturally, the next question is, what part of your entire universe of activities are you looking to do? Is it headquarters, marketing? Is it to actually offer regulated services like arranging, providing custody? Are you going to extend it to actually doing broker-dealer type arrangements? And when we have this discussion, if it's a regulated activity, it really comes down to a couple of fundamental aspects. One is being able to fully appreciate the spirit with which our regulatory framework has come into play. Similar to what Vanessa shared, we're very principles-based. Okay? So as opposed to saying that that rule needs to be explicit and you need to comply with the 10 rules and that's it, it's actually understanding the principle and then saying, okay, I can understand the principle, I see the rule that's associated, and I've seen the guidance, and I have a full appreciation for the need, for example, to keep client assets segregated from my own. Why? Because the principle is to ensure that there are protections between those assets, to protect them in the case of bankruptcy, in the case of events that are untoward to the organization, so that your clients are not in any way disadvantaged from those actions. We also see that the nature of governance that the organization has needs to be robust enough to demonstrate that they have a full full understanding of the associated risks. Because one of the conversations is, oh, actually, we're going to outsource that to firm X. Understood, but what governance do you have around those activities to ensure that you continue to maintain oversight so that that outsourced activity is within your risk appetite, you're continuing to manage the key risk indicators and the reporting that needs to happen to the supervisor. And a good example of this is in the area of technology, because fundamentally you might be using a third party, which is cloud hosted, to manage your infrastructure. Is that primary responsibility for you? Are you accountable? To what extent do you control what happens there? We're very keen to see that firms understand the level of control they need to exercise on those third parties, and also the understanding that the systems and controls determine a lot of things in terms of what they can and can't do in ADGM. So earlier I mentioned the virtual assets that we have that are permitted. That's at an asset level. Different firms will have different permitted virtual assets depending on those systems and controls. So if you have systems and controls that permit you to offer 10 of them, you can go ahead and offer 10 of those virtual assets. For another firm, they might have them for 5. And so that importance on a firm-by-firm level appreciation, we think is an important place for firms to be able to focus early on. And we see that in the past, the firms that used to come to ADGM were maybe very early stage startups, very new to the technology, very new to the industry, very new to regulations. We're seeing a shift in that, so that now more of the firms that are coming fully understand the technology, fully understand the industry, and have a strong appreciation for regulation. So that makes the conversation significantly easier to in terms of bridging the aspects that we would be expecting. I guess the last item that I can talk about, and we sort of keep this at the back of our minds on everything we do, are the aspects of, Vanessa talked about privacy coins, traceability. It's all part of the overarching umbrella of financial crime, and knowing what does that mean for what you're building. Is it something that you are pushing as an action for the user? Is it something you're enshrining into your own protocol or your own service? Is there a third party carrying out an activity which provides you the assurance you need for your own activity and for your clients? And just being very clear on where that sits in this entire universe of activities, so that you can demonstrate that obviously your service and your products are not being used for terrorism financing and so forth. And so those fundamental blocks, as long as they're there, the rest of the aspects tend to be much easier to actually have a discussion about.
Yeah, so we take a very similar approach in how we engage with VASPs that are new and interested in coming into the ecosystem. It typically involves us sitting with them and having conversations around to understand and better understand their business model and what it is they're trying to do in the Dubai market. We also, we license by activity, so it's really about also making sure that they're actually, their business model, where it fits within the scope of the activities that we have. And making sure that it's the right fit. And in a lot of cases, we have VASPs that are coming in that are doing multiple activities, and we definitely take that into account and in the licensing process. I think, too, it's for us in a very similar way to what Brian said. We're looking at some of the, we take sort of by activity a risk-based approach as well when we're assessing some of the basic requirements, right, around governance, around compliance, around company requirements. So, for example, we have a requirement of a minimum of 2 senior management. One of them has to be a head of compliance or a compliance officer. Now, there is the option to outsource things like CISO, MLRO. However, depending on the size of the VASP, depending on the risk of the activity, it is within we may determine that there are certain functions that you should be keeping inside in your in-house more. So we do that on a case-by-case basis, and we're very strongly looking at other governance structures that can support the size and the scope and the risk of what you're trying to do in the Dubai market. Obviously, we have a slightly different process in the sense that as you're coming into the ecosystem, you're also going through one of our many free zones in the process. And so we work hand in hand with the commercial licensing entities as well to take VASPs through that licensing and assessment process and to make sure that they're being able to operate in a robust way here, but still meeting our requirements. So yeah, just there.
No, I thought that was a really brilliant overview, and it's great to hear too that it sounds like the industry itself is progressing a lot more in terms of the appreciation of regulation, like you were just pointing out. But talking about progress, you touched on this earlier, Brian, but I'd love to address it directly. How are you thinking about DeFi? What's your stance on DeFi? I think that is probably one of the most difficult areas in terms of regulation. We've seen a lot of conversation around the world, so I'd love to hear how you guys are thinking about it.
Okay, so just to take a step back and think about what DeFi seeks to achieve, right? Because fundamentally, the way we see it, DeFi is really providing the financial services that we already consume today, right? It's looking to provide the ability to save, the ability to borrow, and in many ways, the end outcome from someone who uses DeFi are very similar to what you would have in the traditional finance space. Now that said, there have been different publications globally, whether it's the French, IOSCO, and others coming out and saying this is how we see DeFi on a similar risk, similar activity perspective, or likewise. And our view on DeFi is something where starting out last year we published this discussion paper, and what it was really bringing out were a couple of key points. One is the importance of ensuring that there is a level playing field between DeFi and traditional finance when it comes to regulated activity. So we don't want to see that there's a heavy burden applied to one versus the other. If you're offering the same service, same outcome, right? But you may have equivalent risks. They might be quite different, obviously, because you're using a smart contract to do this, whereas they're not as a traditional financial company. We want to be able to see that the level of activity from a regulated perspective is not overly burdensome on the DeFi protocol, for example, or the DeFi service provider. We also appreciate that the safeguards need to be similar, right? Because I often think about the simplified analogy of the smart contracts behaving like this vending machine, and you kind of walk to it, you put in your 5 dirhams, you expect the bottle of water costs 2 dirhams, you expect 3 dirhams back. If you don't get 3 dirhams back, something's wrong, right? Or if you get water and the water is poisoned, something's still wrong. So we're trying to make sure that the safeguards you have are that whoever is providing that DeFi service is able to demonstrate that they have protections, that they're identifying from a know your transaction wallet address screening capability, that these addresses, these people who are interacting with my protocol are not doing so with proceeds of financial crime. Because that, again, is the kind of tainting that becomes a challenge for anyone else to be comfortable to use these DeFi service providers. We believe that there are activities that are in DeFi today which are fundamentally technology services. So if you go and run your own validator node, you're staking, fantastic. That, at the end of the day, is something that anyone can do in an individual capacity, and you may be consuming a technology service to do that. That's a technology service. But if you go up the chain on staking and start to say, well, now I am pooling resources, I am collecting the proceeds from various people and staking on their behalf. Maybe I'm providing a liquid staking token. Maybe I'm determining which protocol, from a yield farming perspective, I am going to provide this stake to so that I can earn the highest yield. That now starts to behave more like an asset manager, because you're managing assets, right? You're maybe doing some collective investment type activities, which is more in a regulated activity space, and that's where we're exploring quite a bit at the moment. We also appreciate that the risks associated with the smart contracts are quite different. And I'll give an example, just going back to actually later to one of your earlier questions. It is not so much only what the industry needs to do, it's also what we as supervisors need to be able to see from a supervisory monitoring perspective.
Yep.
And I mentioned earlier that we didn't, the industry yet doesn't have the kind of tooling that can allow us to look at a smart contract's risk profile today and then monitor that smart contract over time, because we want to be able to know, is the risk associated with that DeFi protocol going up, or is it actually level or going down? Because if it is rising, those are indicators that we need to then have a conversation with that device service provider around safeguards, around what's changing the risk. Because fundamentally at this point, most of the focus is on security risks, which is quite right. But there are other risks that the smart contracts may have. If someone has an economic attack or there's some fundamental feature that turns out to be a mechanism for compromise of the smart contract, the entire capability of that DeFi service provider becomes compromised. And I think the nature of the activities we're doing now, just to give some more context, is working very closely with the industry. Just as Vanessa said, this is an evolving space.
Yeah.
Part of the challenge is making sure that there's an understanding of taxonomy, because even when we say something like staking, you get different responses from different people depending on what that actually means. We also see that that taxonomy will help us, once we understand what we're talking about, it will help us to be able to then speak to specific expectations. It will allow us to think about the type of tools. We as a regulator, for example, are building an internal tool in collaboration with 2 universities that will allow us to do that risk profile monitoring for the smart contracts. Why is that important? Because we see that unless we as regulators can supervise more efficiently and effectively these service providers, then you're left using traditional tools to monitor something futuristic. And that's, there's a complete dislocation there. And a lot of effort that we're putting is in that space. So we're working, for example, right now with a firm that's doing tokenized commercial paper. And that is something that in the institutional space is a very, very established and well understood product. What are the benefits of tokenizing? Your clearing and settlement becomes very efficient. If you're able to bring on-chain your auction-based mechanism, those kind of capabilities for the industry are very, very transparent. For us as regulators, it's now a question of how do we supervise that and how do we give them the right safeguards for anyone who's participating with that DeFi protocol. And one of the challenges as well for the industry is that identity ability. So if I am looking at the wallet address, can I identify that that wallet address is permitted to interact with my protocol? And if the answer is yes, you allow them to consume and use your services. If the answer is no, you need to have a mechanism to prevent that from, from that consumption from happening. So we're very keen, to see that the regulatory frameworks in this space develop. We're looking to push out a consultation paper in Q1 next year. It's active at the moment, so it's an area that we think there is substantive potential in the future of once you start to move real-world assets and bringing on a lot more tokenization, a lot of what we're talking about today becomes real for institutional players and enterprises like we were talking about earlier.
We're running out of time, but I'd love to hear Vara's stance on DeFi as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as I mentioned before, we actually already have several DeFi and DAO VASPs coming through the pipeline, and in a similar fashion to ADGM, because we're looking at a principle and activity-based approach, we are evaluating what it is that they're actually doing in the market. And what we're finding is that a lot of these these entities that are coming through are actually in several ways adapting to meeting some of our essential regulatory requirements, like having designated senior management, even if they're in a DAO structure, being able to meet basic AML KYC requirements. So there are some fundamentals that are sort of non-negotiable from a regulatory perspective, but we're finding that there are business models that take a sort of either a hybrid approach or are able to adapt to these regulatory requirements. And what we're doing is that as we're going through that process, we're in learning mode, right? And similar to what Brian said, is that this is going to be a space for us that's constantly evolving. And we're learning quite a bit from the licensing process as we're evaluating and doing the due diligence on these VASPs prior to issuing them a license. We're seeing quite a bit from a use case perspective. I mean, we have a couple of DeFi aggregators that are in our pipeline, but also we're seeing quite a bit in the GameFi space around DAOs and gaming VASPs that are actually incorporating decentralized governance into their business models. So this has been a really good way for us to begin to explore how we would, again, similar to how we've done in other areas, including staking, by the way. For us, when we launched our regulation, staking fell under asset management. We've now also incorporated it under our custody rulebook as well. So we're just this is something that will be further developed, and we may come out with amendments to our regulations that are very specific to DeFi and DAOs early next year. Yeah.
It pains me to say that that's all we've got time for, but I just want to say thank you so much to the both of you, because I feel like it really wasn't that long ago that you would not see two regulators on stage at a crypto conference on a Saturday. I think it's a real testament to that industry engagement that you were talking about in terms of wanting to get to know who are the builders, who are driving this industry forward. And I love the sentiment around having a new approach. I've often thought taking what we already had in terms of regulatory frameworks is like taking a horse and cart and trying to retrofit it to a rocket ship. So thank you for your open-mindedness in terms of this new technology. So round of applause for these guys. Thank you so much. And that's it.
Thank you.